Fractions. We all love fractions. Let's go through these fractions on the page. The first one we have is 1/2, 1 over 2, and then 1/3 and 1/4, 1/5, 1/6, 1/7, 1/8, 1/9, and 1/10. They are all fractions. Fractions of a whole. With 1/2, I need 2 halves to make a whole, 2 2s. With 1/3, I need 3 thirds to make a whole. Can you see the pattern? How many 9ths do I need to make one whole? How many 7ths? Can you tell me? Equivalent fractions. Equivalent means equal, the same. Fractions that are the same size. Their numbers are different, but their sizes are the same. Let's look at this board. Can you remember this board? Didn't I make you make one of these? Do you still have them at home? Let's look at the top one. 1 whole. That is a full whole, and it gets broken into 2 to make 2 halves. It gets broken into 3 to make 3 3s. You see and a 1/4 and a 1/5 and a 6 and an 8 and a 10, and there's 12s. On this board, you can very clearly make out the equivalent fractions. If you use a ruler and mark lines, you can see all the different ones that are exactly the same size, but they use different numbers. For example, you can clearly see that 1/4, 2 8ths, and 3 12ths are exactly the same size. You can also see that 3 6s, 4 8ths, 5 10ths, and 6 12ths make a half. Very, very clearly. So those are all equal in size. That is what it means to be an equivalent fracture. Let's look at 1/3. 1/3 is the same as 2 6s and 4 12s. Can you see that they are broken up into more pieces, but they are still the same size?
Hi, and welcome to Math Antics. In the last video, we learned how easy it is to add and subtract fractions that have the same bottom number. We call those like fractions. But often you'll be asked to add or subtract fractions that have different bottom numbers, or unlike fractions. And we learned that the only way we can do that is to change our fractions so that they do have the same bottom number. Alright then, how do we do that? How can we change 2 unlike fractions into 2 like fractions? How do we get our fractions to have a common denominator? The answer is we need to use equivalent fractions. You remember what equivalent fractions are, right? They're fractions that have the same value but use different top and bottom numbers, like 1/2 and 2/4. They both represent 1/2 but with different numbers. Well, whenever we have 2 unlike fractions that we need to add, if we could find equivalent fractions to use instead, and if those new equivalent fractions had the same bottom numbers as each other, then we'd be all set. We'd have 2 like fractions, and we could add them using our procedure. Okay, but how do we find equivalent fractions that have a common denominator, or the same bottom number? Well, there's 2 main ways of doing it. In this video, we're only going to learn the first way of doing it, and I like to call this way finding the easiest common denominator. In the next video, we'll talk about another method that some of you may have already heard about. It's called finding the least common denominator. Okay, so how does this easiest common denominator method work? Well, even though this is an easy method, it might sound a little complicated at first. But don't worry, it'll make a lot more sense once you've seen a few examples. In this method, the common denominator is always going to be the product of the bottom numbers. In other words, it will be the number you'd get if you multiplied the bottom numbers together. Basically, all we're going to do is take the two different bottom numbers and make two different whole fractions using them. Then, we're going to move the whole fractions to the opposite sides and multiply them by our unlike fractions. Doing this will give us two new equivalent fractions that will have the same bottom number. Then, we can add or subtract them easily. Okay, let's try a couple examples so we can see this method in action. Let's add the fractions 2 over 5 and 1 over 3. These are not like fractions because they have different bottom numbers, so we're going to change them. And the common denominator we will use is the product of the bottom numbers. 5 times 3 equals 15. We change them by multiplying each fraction by a whole fraction. The first whole fraction is going to be 3 over 3, because 3 is the second fraction's denominator. And the second whole fraction is going to be 5 over 5, because 5 is the first fraction's denominator. Next, we multiply starting with our first fraction. On the top, 3 times 2 equals 6. And on the bottom, 3 times 5 equals 15. So our first fraction has become 6 over 15. Now for the second fraction. On the top, 1 times 5 equals 5. And on the bottom, 3 times 5 equals 15. So our second fraction has become 5 over 15. Now we just add them using our procedure for adding like fractions. We add the top numbers, 6 plus 5 equals 11, and then we keep the same bottom number, which is 15. So that means the answer to 2 over 5 plus 1 over 3 is 11 over 15. That's pretty easy, huh? All right, let's see one more example of this method. Let's add the fractions 7 over 8 and 3 over 10. Our common denominator for this problem is going to be 80, because that's what we get when we multiply the denominators together. 8 times 10 equals 80. We'll multiply our 7 over 8 by the whole fraction 10 over 10. And we'll multiply our 3 over 10 by the whole fraction 8 over 8. Then, when we do our multiplication, the 8 times 10 will give us 80 on the bottom of both fractions. For the top of the first fraction, we have 7 times 10 equals 70. And the top of the second fraction, we have 3 times 8 equals 24. Now that we have like fractions, we can just add the top numbers. 70 plus 24 equals 94. And keep the bottom number the same, 80. So, 7 over 8 plus 3 over 10 equals 94 over 80. Some of you see that this answer could be simplified. Be sure to check out our videos on mixed numbers and simplifying fractions to see how you could do that for your final answer. All right, that's the first way you can find the common denominator and change your unlike fractions into like fractions so you can add or subtract them easily. Remember, practice is really important in math. So be sure to do the exercises for this section so you really get the hang of it. After that, check out the next video and I'll show you how to use a different method to find what we call the least common denominator. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Learn more at mathantics.com.